Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate them at the table. I'm Nathan,
I'm Alex.
I'm Lex.
I'm Holly.
so let's see who's in the waiting room. Today we're consulting on an acute case of critically reading scenarios. We'll discuss lessons we've learned to pick scenarios with good bones before attempting to reanimate and run them at our tables. Now, let's begin our consultation. Holly, what do you look for when you start critically reading a scenario?
Um, so the thing that I look for first, what I do, this is probably the former teacher within me, is the first thing I do when I get my hands on a scenario is I read for comprehension and understanding. So I look through it, I read it front to back, and I don't think too much about like plot holes and things like that. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
taking it in and considering the plot of it, whether the plot grabs me, because that'll be honestly, that is the very first thing, even if it ends up being um not super great or there's lots of like issues with it that need to be retooled. If it's an interesting plot, if there's an interesting story, I'm a sucker for a good story.
So you're just kind of putting all the characters, events, everything in mind, and then
Yes.
you go back through again. Uh,
Yeah.
how many times do you reread it, do you think?
I'll read it like twice. The first time I'll
Okay.
read it and I'm thinking like, if I were a player, would this be a fun story to kind of unfold in as I'm playing it? So that's the first thing I consider. And then if it gets the check for me and I'm like, yeah, okay, I feel more invested in this, then I go back and read it a second time and I start critically reading it and thinking about um does it make sense? Does whatever draws
Mhm.
the players in actually make sense? Do the trail of clues make sense? That kind of thing. So
Yeah, that's great. Keeping an idea of the clue trail is where I see a lot of scenarios run into issues is they have big gaps where you go, I don't see how you get from A to B. And that's the part I have to reread again because sometimes the authors kind of come in and give some context, and other times you really see a problem that people could get hung up on.
This was a big issue that I had between reading and then actually running Extremophilia. That was actually one of the first Delta Green scenarios that I ran beginning to end in terms of the larger ones. And there were a lot of factors in it that made sense, and it was a very interesting progression and a lot of spinning plates from a GM, a handler side of things. But then at the table, I found that there were some pretty significant gaps that, like, I can tell that things are escalating and ramping up, but the players really couldn't.
Mhm.
And needing to find ways to help nudge them or like get them closer to these clues, it's definitely changed how I've read scenarios to be more in line with Holly, what you just recommended. Like, I'm reading it as if a sort of a movie is playing out in my head, but from the players' perspectives, how well could they follow a thread from beginning to end?
Alex, I think you've had some ideas about how you'd like to map out some clues in that fashion. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so after I do my initial read through of a scenario because it's gotten my interest, I will see how it works out mechanically and I'll try and figure out the flow of it without running it yet. And that involves pretty much writing down locations and the clues that can be found at the locations. And then I'll kind of write down what the player characters will learn from said clue and if that clue leads to another clue. So if you do this for all your locations and your clues, then you'll have a nice list or flow chart really of how this scenario is going to go.
Mhm.
And I find that to be quite useful when just at a glance you can see how complicated a scenario is or not, and you can actually really tell if it's linear because then each clue will just go right to the next one.
Yep. With
Yeah.
no variation in the order that they can be found is another worrying point.
hmm I think expanding on this too is I always am mindful with how the NPCs, including any antagonists in a scenario, what their motivations and thoughts may be like, sort of behind the
Mhm.
curtain. And if they are an NPC that players can encounter and deal with, what they may know, what their motivations may be, do those motivations make sense? in contributing to this overall narrative. If they are the BBEGs, that actually doesn't work so well over an audio medium. If it's the antagonists or the bad guys, what their motivations are and why these things are happening, so that it makes it easier for me as a GM to improvise, like what may happen next at the table if I know where they're coming from, if I know what their goals are. That Alex, I really like that flowchart mapping idea. I think I would also just add maybe as little bubbles as the NPCs and where they may be along this map.
Yeah, and just to continue on with that, the flowchart's a really nice place to just visualize when a scenario has choke points or points where you have a clue that's locked behind a roll, and then that's like the end of the scenario if they never get that roll. That way you can mediate it and change it before it happens at the table, and then you're unprepared. A really cool exercise you can do, it's a nice thought exercise, is you could run through the scenario in your head, but have every single roll fail. So if every single roll fails in this scenario,
It's like Nathan's playing.
you can kind of imagine, all right, well, what happens, right? If you can't think of something that pushes the scenario forward, whether that be a bang where something happens to the players to push things along, then that scenario is pretty much dead in the water.
And I think on the flip side of that, I also try to think of what players could do that might accidentally short circuit a scenario. Could they stumble into the warehouse where the ritual is happening and just like wander right into the monster 2 hours in? Could they, I don't know, get themselves kidnapped by the evil folks and completely short circuit a lot of things in there? Trying to identify issues like that and iron them out ahead of time, because sometimes, we've mentioned scenarios may assume things go from one area logically into the next, but if someone skips something, does that really mess with something down the line? Then that's something that you want to pay attention to in rereading it again.
That kind of goes into what I think about a lot is the pacing of the scenario, and how slow and methodical you want it to be, where you want them to hit that point where things start to just ramp up and move really quickly, and thinking about that in terms of locations and if they go here first, like that's going to change everything, and so that can also kind of determine how information is presented to your players as well. If you really don't want them to go to the museum first, maybe kind of, you know, I don't like sheepdogging my players, but sometimes you have to like do a little bit of
Or
guidance.
at least like giving them carrots, like give them a compelling
Right.
reason to
Yeah.
check out something
Sure.
else
Yeah.
first.
That's good. That's right.
Yeah. That's, I don't know, this gets into conversations of railroading, but one of the biggest issues that will set off alarms in my mind when doing that initial read through of a scenario is if it reads like someone's short story or like their headcanon mental movie. That's a really bad sign, because the scenario is written that it's assuming things will go from one thing to the
Yeah.
next, or in some cases, like a recent recording, they may force things to go from one stage to a next, which just really is unfun for everyone involved, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's difficult because very rarely do players think exactly the same way as the game master or the writer did. So having the flexibility written in is key. I think the Alexandrian might be the first time they've kind of talked about the 3 clue rule as ways to make sure you're flexible. And that's basically to say everywhere should be reachable by 3 clues. So if you don't find one, you might find another. It doesn't have to be the same place, same role, but there should be multiple ways to reach a conclusion, a destination, something. It shouldn't be locked down. But I did want to return, Lex, you'd mentioned of what happens if they really fuck it up, right? Is they get captured or something. That's a great idea to think about that while you're critically reading, because sometimes you hit that and you go, "Oh, that's better. I really like that idea."
Mm.
And you can kind of plan out of, well, if this happens, let me get prepared at the table to handle this in an interesting way so that I'm not scrambling at game time to say, ah, they did get captured. What am I supposed to do? They get eaten. The end. There might be more interesting things.
I love that idea. Being able to anticipate, do they fuck this up? Okay, cool. How can I make this cool? How can I be able to roll with it? And like, you don't need to have everything planned far ahead out, like, oh, this is the full direction things are going. But at least having an idea so that if something similar happens, you're a little more prepared to that you're able to improvise something and keep the flow very well without clearly scrambling at the table.
So let's talk a little bit more about the flow of games. Holly, you had mentioned you're kind of looking at these of when you want it to run, the pacing, when do you want it to walk, when do you want it to run? What's your general feeling for how you approach it for one shots, longer term? What are you looking for there?
Ooh, that's two different ball games, right? One shots are easier in my mind. I like to think of things almost cinematically, like you want this very interesting, like slow build up, the slow tension and horror, the maybe not the big reveal, but this a reveal that kind of horrifies, intrigues, gives players a little bit something to keep them moving. And then you have usually like an event or some catalyst that starts this fast, um, like fast downhill run until the very end of the scenario when they feel like they're being pursued or they are pursuing something. So I guess the heart of that is just following the storytelling, movie and cinematic kind of
Mhm.
pacing is what I think is interesting because when I read scenarios, I try to view everything from the perspective of my players because they're my audience. Like at the end of the day, they are receiving this story. So what is it looking like from their perspective?
I think it's getting in mind too, like what scenes do you want to deliver? That's really, I also think about these in a very cinematic fashion. And typically it's the thing that excited me about the scenario, or at least whenever I'm reading and writing, if I think something could be really cool, I will pay special attention to that and be sure that, like,
Mhm.
trying to instill this is a really tense, a really dramatic, this big reveal or climax explosion, kicking a gravity grenade off the top of a national monument, like trying to get something really neat there for players so that everyone can have a great story to tell after the session's over.
To add on to that, if I'm reading through the scenario and that's just inspiring more and more ideas from what I'm reading, that's always a good sign. Like if I'm reading a stat block and I see the creature can do this special ability, I'm now thinking of, oh, well, how can I use that to scare the players and have my own custom scenes as well? So yeah, if it inspires you, definitely write that down so you can augment your main story with that and your players will love it.
So let's talk a little bit about mechanics. When you're reading these, we kind of talked about how you mentioned reading for comprehension. During part of that, I assume a lot of the games we run will have unique mechanics for a specific scenario. How do you bring those into your mind on your second read through? Does that change how you view them?
Oh yeah, for sure. If there's mechanics, special mechanics can apply to different things. It could be your BBUG, a location, something, some catalyst that changes everything. And so a lot of the times, especially if it's a well-written scenario, like you'll read it the first time and you'll see these notes, and then you read it the second time and you're like,
Hmm.
aha, I see. This is where this all plays in together. So yes, definitely. If something pings my radar is this is going to be a little bit different than Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green, whatever is being played, then I keep that in the forefront of my mind when I go back and read through it again. Like, okay, where are we going to really see that shine?
Out of curiosity, how do you all go about deciding what scenarios you want to read? Whenever you're searching, you're wanting to run something, do you have like ideas for a type of game that you want to run? You bought a new book that's a compilation of scenarios. How do you go about picking and choosing?
I rely on the many communities that are now available to RPG players and just word of
Hmm.
mouth and positive reviews from people that I know and trust their opinions on. Sometimes I have fallen into the just got a lot of really good reviews on Drive Through RPG, but to that point, it's usually I want to know that people like it before I spend money on it. And if I do spend money on it and I go read it and it's not really what I was wanting, then I get a little
Yeah.
I get stubborn at that point, and then I do the RPG Reanimators section where I'm like, okay, we are gonna cut this up and make it into something because I spent some money on it.
I think a beautiful cover, right? I completely agree. The RPG subreddit has cost me a lot of money over time. Lex, you've cost me a lot of money over time. Alex, you too. This is my airing of grievances, folks. Stop telling me about things because I will buy them and I will read them. And there is a point to that, right? Is if a picture and a sort of just short elevator pitch of the idea is enough, I mean, I'll start looking at that. That's great stuff.
I know. Apparently, Holly judges books by their covers.
I do. If it's a pretty cover, if it's interesting, even if
Mm.
the title is neat. And I'm a huge sucker for interesting handouts. Like
Mm.
Signal to Noise with their
Hell
really
yeah.
interesting delivery of handouts being videos instead of just like paper handouts. I am a sucker for handouts.
Yeah, I love it whenever I see a Kickstarter that has like, oh, you can get a patch or a pin or something or some little extra thing that I'm ashamed of it, but it's true. Is I just look at that and go, oh, that's pretty neat. I wonder if that ties into the game at all. And yeah, I'm a sucker for style, but I don't want to talk all the time about Morkborg. Um, Alex, I
That's
know
what
you.
Cyborg is for.
Yeah. You got to have the style to actually inform the reading. I think there is an aspect of if it
Mm.
was plain text when I'm reading it, I'm not as impressed. Like I don't necessarily get the vibe. But when you have a game like Morkborg or Cyborg where the style is so in there, I mean it's really a very simple system. The world's very flexible and open, but it's not like super deeply described. But the art carries it so beautifully to give you an idea of what am I looking for here. You don't need tons and tons of paragraphs.
Well, and it also, in my opinion, gets any potential GMs in the mood, in the
Hmm.
mindset. Morkborg is fucking brutal. Everything is all fucked up and gnarly. Same thing with Cyborg, but there's capitalism now. And so, like, being able to read it with that gritty, especially like the creators, they have playlists that you can get on Spotify to like get you in the mindset, I find just helps seed a lot of creativity so that there doesn't need to be a lot in the scenario there or doesn't necessarily need to be so much there.
Hmm.
Bluebeard's Bride is like that too. The book is just so beautiful and evocative, and the art
Yeah.
is so interesting and thought provoking in a lot of places. It's not a scenario. I realize that, so I don't want to derail the conversation too much. But yeah, it's like that too. It's just very evocative of its topic. It's yeah,
You
I'd
heard
say
it here,
four.
folks. Holly says judge books by their covers
I do.
uh,
It's so
that's
pretty.
and handouts.
there I think there is a level of when we talk about critically reading for scenarios, we're also talking about the rule sets behind them, right? A lot of these, like if you look at Cyborg and stuff, they're short adventures, but a lot of it is the book itself presenting you with paths to make a short campaign. And that's another aspect of if I read a book and it gives me nothing to draw on beyond the adventure, I'm gonna have a hard time. But if you look at, I keep using Workborg as an example. There are tables. They give you adventure prompts. They give you creatures, and you can just roll on them. So if I'm feeling really lazy, I go, "What are we looking at? They're crossing a bridge, and the murder seagulls show up. Awesome. That's I have an hour of gameplay right there, and you can kind of wing it. Like it, it'll be fun."
Yeah, some of the best sessions I've ever played in have just been just a bullet point, and then everyone just riffing on that and just blowing it way out of proportion.
So on another note, Alex, I know you play more Pathfinder games. You run these sort of games. you have to look more at the number side of things than us. How does that affect your critical reading?
Yeah, so when I'm reading through a scenario and I'm looking at the creatures or monster section, I'm thinking to myself, okay, what kind of how is this going to affect my player characters, right? If I see a monster that does like 20 damage on average to someone, while that might be okay in a fantasy game like Pathfinder Second Edition, that's not okay in Call of Cthulhu, even in Pulp, really.
But I want my investigators to cast Fireball,
Right,
Alex.
right. So I would definitely change up some of the damage um,
Mhm.
to make it more appropriate for the tone and the system I'm playing. I'm also looking at things like traps and anything that deducts resources from the player characters.
Mm.
Like health is a resource, sanity is a resource. I keep in mind what that's going to do, right? So if this is showing up early in the scenario and it's doing like D20 sand damage for like no reason at all, like that's kind of a warning flag.
And I know some people really like the idea of lethality being an option from the start. How do you guys look at sessions like this when the pacing can change so dramatically? Do you allow for that, or do you kind of tamp it down at the beginning?
I definitely allow it. So I keep in mind the pacing that the author is trying to share, like in their vision of writing the scenario, and I try to respect that. Like if the author has a great idea and wants to introduce everything with like a bang, oh yeah, I'll respect that. But the author also has to show me that they can write it well.
I I am guilty of going easy on my players, and so I kind of take lethality, and I invoke the GM privilege of like all of this is hidden information. I love it when players think that everything is super super deadly, and once we get into combat, I will like hit the gas or pump the brakes, really kind of depending on where I want this to go. Do I think it's very interesting? And Seth Skorkowski's done a video on this too. Do I think it's interesting if the BBEG comes out swinging, D100 damage and TPK within an hour of this game? No, I don't think that's interesting at all.
Mhm.
So just kind of doing that, speed up, slow down of being a GM and kind of making those judgment calls of, I don't think it's interesting to kill a player, you know, an hour into something that we're all going to be here for 4 hours to play, unless there's an interesting backup, an
Mhm.
interesting alternative. Some scenarios do have that where someone dies really early and purposefully, and you put, and it kind of opens the door for something more interesting to occur, and I'm all on board with that. But if it's just lethal just to be lethal, and you know I GM privilege of all this is hidden information. The bad guy is gonna do as much damage to you as I want it to do, and if it's thematically appropriate, basically. So
I think, Nathan, getting to your real question of, how do you feel about lethality right out of the gate, killing players, doing all the damage, blah, blah, blah. I would say I may allow it as a general exception to the rule. I think if every encounter is deadly, if someone can get hit by a car when they're crossing the street to go make their library roll, that is boring.
yeah, I agree with what you're saying. That's basically what the heart of what I was saying is too. If there's an interesting reason why people are going to be dying super early, absolutely, I'll allow it. Let's go, because I am 100% on board with just interesting plots and narration. But if it's just lethal because it's lethal, and people are going to have to create new things, I don't mind the BBEG coming in for a little bit, teasing everyone, dealing a bunch of damage, and then fading into the
Mhm.
shadows. But I'm probably not going to kill anybody over that.
It's a pretty good sign that if you do have this big bang and like something super lethal, that something is written really well, is that the author has prepared for that and is giving you pre-generated characters
Oh yeah.
as backup PCs.
Yeah.
And on top of that, like maybe even a section to reintegrate these backup PCs into the scenario.
Yeah, that's getting into my main issue with it is I would do it if it is done well, if there's a compelling reason for it. I wouldn't just do it because it's there necessarily. If an author is going to say, yeah, this thing can come in and raffle stomp, cool. What else? What happens next? Is this just going to be like a complete steamroll? That's not very fun.
Will it be fun for the players?
Well, I think in puppet shows that the bad guy is so insanely statted out compared to anyone else that it's not fun. You're encouraged to have people in as bullet sponges because it's too lethal to begin with. That is not done well. If you're having like a essentially a prologue set of characters that meet a very bad end, and then you have pre-gens that are ready to bring in afterwards, that can be really cool. That can have a nice scene to set a tone for the rest of the actual scenario itself.
Yeah, I want to kind of go off of that. If you're going to have a case where they can be stopped, I really love it when there are options other than character death, right? Is if someone is scarred, if they are captured, if there's some secondary way out provided through the text, that's something I'm looking for. And it's really helpful if it's written there and I don't have to come up with a reason. But Lex, you had mentioned kind of this other characters and stuff. The Gauntlet has a very neat idea called the unseen, where you'll have all the players contribute to a scene that the actual player characters that are coming in know nothing about, right? It is a complete side tangent scene. If you think of it like a television show, it would be just an intercut of, somebody's jogging and the murderer comes up behind him and gets him. But that might be a fun way, and I wish more of the games had this in it, of providing context and tone without it necessarily endangering the player characters.
This is something that Shams recently did really well for his Into the Darkness run of The Last Equation. He starts off with, and it feels like a TV show, it feels like a movie where you sort of from an audience viewpoint, you see a murder happen, you see something happen, and the thing that kicks off all of the rest of the investigation. Then you have the briefing, then player characters are brought in to see the full aftermath of what happened. Like you can see someone walking into a house and then windows flashing as gunshots are going off, and that's a good job of tone setting before you have, hi Larry, what is your regular day like? Well, now you're called into this. And I felt that he did that exceedingly well, and I think that it is an interesting device to bring in because it can be something that you can use to set tones for scenarios before actually getting into it without risking killing off your players' characters wantonly, because that's a great way for them to lose all investment and interest in the actual game itself, or at least providing them pre-gens that can then die in a prologue scene, then having their actual characters make an entrance.
And as always, we're not talking about Mork Borg in this case because it's so fast to roll up a character. The instant lethality is a bonus, not a accident.
It's a feature, not a glitch. Or it's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, exactly. I think, Holly, of the group of us, you've probably run the most long form campaigns.
Yeah, I've run a couple.
How do you go about looking at those differently?
That's a challenge, honestly. And I would recommend anyone that's thinking about taking on a campaign, do read it front to back, cover to cover before you sit down at a table with people. And that's hard because some campaigns, y'all, are long.
Why are
So
you
I
making eye
sympathize.
contact with me the whole time you're saying this? Impossible
Lex,
Landscapes
no.
is hard.
It's hard. It really is hard. But like understanding every step of the way what is likely to happen, because I speak from experience. Your players make a decision that you don't realize because you haven't read the entire thing is going to be very impactful and maybe not in the way you were wanting it to go.
That's a great point.
So like really reading everything critically, and the pacing of campaigns is so different. And hopefully a well-written campaign will kind of help guide the GM on the pacing of it, because it requires just a different eye. It's less cinematic because you're going to have the stop start. For example, I ran Two-Headed Serpent. No spoilers. I know not everyone has played it, but you have lots of different locations, and there's going to be places where your PCs have downtime. So there's not this like complete, beginning to end fully ramp up, and then everything's a downhill slide. It's a lot of stop, go, stop, go, stop, go. So in cases like that, finding the small cinematic moments within the pieces that your characters are engaging with can be something and that's probably something that I do a lot too, is carving out the little movies within the big campaign of it all. So, if they start in Bolivia is like its own movie, and then they take a break, they go to
Mhm.
New York or wherever, and then it's a whole other thing.
So do you usually have the characters already made through a session 0 at this point, so you have them in mind on that read through, or do you worry about that later?
I worry about that later. I want my players to play exactly the type of people they are interested in
Mhm.
playing. And yeah, I can say this now. I'm playing a Cold Fire Within, and 100% no. So out of the 5 players I have, I think one of them at this point realistically would still be going along in the campaign,
Sure.
just from like a metagaming like, my guy, why would my guy be doing this anymore? But if everyone's on board with it, and then everyone's like, yeah, of course, no, you're not going to be doing this, but we're doing it for the fun. I would rather have that metagame moment of, yeah, we realize you wouldn't, but the trade is you're playing someone you actually want to play, not this person that fits in the box of what I really
Mm.
need you to be playing right now. So that's the GM challenge of bringing the people that normally wouldn't be brought into it and keeping them going. But yeah, to me that's an interesting challenge. So no, I don't keep that in mind when I read any scenarios. It's just going to be a
Nice.
let's go. But that's something I do when I read is assuming my players bring people who are not in typical investigators, how am I going to get them invested into this is something I do think about, because my players tend to not pick typical people to play with.
Do you end up rereading the chapters? I know this is a tendency, Lex, you've done in the past, is as you're approaching a new chapter, you'll reread it again to kind of refresh your memory. How does your approach differ that time than before?
I think, sort of getting into Holly's point, I will read the full campaign book cover to cover once, then start again to start doing the taking notes. And if I'm making any alterations or any edits and things, get it in there so that I have a more or less cohesive block that I can work from there. I'm currently running Holly and some other folks through Impossible Landscape. So it's a little different. It's a whole different beast of a campaign. But I will then take their experiences thus far and then use that to kind of pre-render the next chapter going forward.
Hmm.
So at least I know what they have done. I know the main points of the next chapter that I want to fulfill. And then if they have any like if they have any history, if they have any additional contextual beats that I can find ways to insert into the next chapter going forward, to thread some more personal buy-in, to thread some more context and grounding for their characters to have a real investment in the campaign and to want to go forward, because the people that they care about are getting more drawn into this at a similar rate to the way their characters are.
Yeah, I would typically agree with Lex's procedure of looking through a campaign. I know in Our Ladies of Sorrow, I read through the entire thing and
Mhm.
then read through it again with notes. And in each chapter, I would identify like the important plot elements that really needed to happen or clues that needed to be dropped for the players to succeed. And before I even started that chapter, that way I could focus on that, making another section of like almost like a checklist of, hey, this needs to happen before this scenario ends. And that's my critical reading method.
Mm. And Alex, you've run us through recently a few short pamphlet adventures for the Fist system.
Oh yeah.
Can you talk about how you go about looking at those? Because they're very short and punchy, how do you make those shine?
The
Yeah.
fist game is punchy, you say?
Yeah. I mean,
Maybe.
I know how to do a good fisting.
Bow, 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 bow.
Boo. All right. So when I'm reading these pamphlets, I am looking at, hey, what ideas can I riff on? If what I'm reading um, excites me, that's like a really good sign because then my ideas kind of snowball. So, for example, if you're in a scenario that you're in the mountains and it's just saying, oh, the characters will come and encounter a guard patrol, 46
Mhm.
guards or something. I'm like, okay, well, what does that look like? Maybe that's a snowmobile chase, and then maybe a
Mm.
helicopter comes in, and that really fits with the tone of Fist, which is super action packed. And then translating that to the actual game, the players had an amazing chase weaving through evergreen trees, going down a mountain while being shot at with like machine guns from snowmobile wielding goons with machine guns, and
Yeah.
it was great. And
It was
that's all
great until the
from
helicopter showed up.
yeah. And then I think we had some werewolf jump on
Oh
each
yeah.
missile to go to the hell. It was wild. Yeah, but that all stemmed from player characters are in this region. They encounter 46 guards.
Mhm.
So if a scenario can really make me think of cool scenes, that's when I decide to choose it.
What sort of things do you all look for when you're going for the tone? Maybe you're coming to the system for the first time. Maybe you've heard some things about it. When you're reading it, how do you kind of inhabit that into your reading?
Probably word choice and what the author is trying to convey. If the author is really focusing on how the environment is, I'll catch on to that and help it along with my own ideas, augmenting it with my own ideas. I really liked like for public access.
Mhm.
It would ask very evocative and thought-provoking questions that you would query to your players, and then you can build a tone off from that.
I'll admit I'm a sucker for fiction. I don't usually love it in a book, but Unknown Armies really does a great job with their short stories in their books of bringing you into the tone. Uh, Vampire bounced off a little bit because I didn't. I kind of wanted to get to the gristle, but Unknown Armies is such a weird setting that I knew so little about that reading that got me in a mindset of like, oh, everybody's insane doing insane things. That's what I should be looking for as I read the rest of this and start looking at the rules and how they work. Is it's just people being crazy. It's great.
I'm the type to really play into the tone set by the system itself.
Mhm.
Because some systems really kind of demand a tone. Like Pulp is very, lives up to its name. Pulp, action packed, fast moving, fast paced. And I always try to honor that and lean into it because a lot of times that's what your players will expect anyway. But Ten Candles, Bluebeard's Bride, Wander Home, they all have a tone set by the system and a very specific. Oh, yes, I know those were all three very tonally different
Yeah.
systems. But like the system itself sets this tone of what it's expecting
Mhm.
from the games, and I try to honor that because a lot of times when people sit down at your table, that's what they come to expect anyway. And even the systems we talk probably the most about, like Delta Green, I love like the 90s era X-Files conspiracy. Like when I play Delta
Mhm.
Green, that's what I love to play up more than anything else. It's my favorite era to play for Delta Green, and that's what I really lean into. So,
I think my simple answer that isn't particularly helpful, if it excites me. If the system itself excites me, then that is going to preoccupy my attention for a while. I have the mothership system, and we recently finished playing Alien Destroyer of Worlds. Right now, Alien has my interest a lot more than Mothership.
Mhm.
And if I run a Mothership scenario, I'm probably going to be more tempted to use it in the Alien system, just as an example, that like, because that's really got me. And so in terms of systems, it could be interchangeable, but that's what piques my interest.
So you're kind of letting the tone that you're excited about inform your reading as you're going through these.
Precisely. And whenever I am looking at material for a system or thinking of running different scenarios with a system in mind, that scenario needs to excite me in some way. It can be in different ways, and I have my own biases. I am generally less excited by 1920s scenarios. So if there is something that needs to be run in the 20s, set in the 20s, whatever, it has a bit of a higher threshold for me to be interested in running it.
Mhm.
Or while reading it, if I feel like it could be easily portable to a more or less modern day, then cool, let's see what else it has that excites me. In this like case in point, I plan to run a 1980s 1990s version of Deadlight, where it is a family that's traveling from one parent's house to another, or from their parents to their grandparents, and but set it in the 80s to have that kind of new coat of paint, but continue on because I think that it's a fun, exciting scenario that caught my interest. But in terms of other systems or scenarios, sometimes it could take itself a bit too seriously. Sometimes it may just be kind of boring and procedural. And
Mhm.
those are the ones that I'll just decide to skip. Sometimes it's clear that the author has a very different idea in mind for what they want to deliver by having published this, that I don't really want to put in the effort to try and do. So I'm going to move on until I find something that does have that spark for me. So entirely subjective and unhelpful.
So when we're looking through these, we're talking generally, I think all of us like to read ahead a fair bit, right? As I'm sure I've read campaigns that I won't run for another year or so. But sometimes you might run into something that someone comes up to you and says, "I want this run tomorrow."
Hmm.
How 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 would you approach that?
Have fun running it tomorrow then. I ain't doing it.
Oh, I don't even read it. I just come up with the idea of what it should be like. No,
Hmm.
I'm kidding.
Hmm. I mean, there is a point to that though, right? Is how how quickly can you go through it and go, I see what they're going for.
Sometimes you have to.
I'll just kind of wing it, right?
I, I think that it's more dependent on the scenario itself. As an example, Tom Rayleigh asked me, they said that they needed a fill in game for a one shot, and if there was anything that I could run. And I I read Good Vibes Only. It's a very simple,
Mhm.
straightforward scenario. I read it that morning and ran it that evening. So I didn't have a lot of changes. I didn't really need a lot of changes. It's pretty solid and it's simple and fun. So in those cases, if you just say, I need to run something, there can be some pretty simple ones like 10 or Poison Soup or some of the other ones that we've discussed here
Mhm.
that don't really need a lot. But those are the exceptions.
So I'd take a leaf out of the Alex Sun book, and if someone hands you a scenario and is like, please, can you run this for me with very short notice? So like you have not chosen for yourself, or whatever the
Mhm.
circumstance. Reading through the first time for comprehension, reading through the second time, and start just making an outline. Like these are the clues. These are where they're gonna, these are the major plot points. These are the major locations, and just kind of giving yourself this very basic outline, and then as a GM, giving yourself a lot of grace. Like I didn't have a lot of time to prepare for this. It may not go exactly the way I want it to, and that's okay.
That gives
So
me so much anxiety just imagining that.
You could also just choose a system or scenario that puts less work on the GM, like public
Mhm.
access, where you're literally asking the players like what scares them or what do they see or how that contributes to the scenario as a whole. And if they're also like technically adding to the story, that's less work that you're doing.
That's a great
it,
point.
it's nice. We've seen a rise in RPG systems that are just no prep or quick prep and rely a lot on the players to drive the narrative. There's several of them, and it's more than several. It's very nice.
I love it because we play with a lot of people that have a lot of experience playing these games. So people's instincts and additions that they make are usually pretty insightful. And even if you've never done that with someone before, try it out. I guarantee they're gonna surprise you with some of the stuff they do, and it'll probably be pretty scary. Sometimes the people you're like, ah, they're nice. They'll come up with the most messed up
And then you're gonna
stuff.
be like, wow, they're a sociopath. Why am I still playing with them?
But I think even in Call of Cthulhu, you can put some of the onus on your players too. Like, tell me what you find. You open the door. Like, what do you see? It's a little bit less traditional way of running Call of Cthulhu. But like, if you're really pressed for time and you're like, oh my god, I can't do this. Some of that you can put on your players, and it'll be all right.
And I'll admit that there are times when I'm reading through a scenario, I might think, there was this other game that I played, and none of the players I'm about to play with were in that one. So I'm gonna steal somebody else's really creepy idea. Like Tin Candles is so good for that, of just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, all these weirdos generated all these creepy ideas. I'm keeping it. I'm keeping it for later.
Yep.
Outsource that shit. Nice.
100%.
I've actually found myself doing that in games outside of the systems that they were meant for.
Mhm.
Like, this is great for buying time. Well, what do you see that scares you? And then I'm like, take notes.
So now here's the difficult question. I've
Oh boy.
admitted I read stuff, way too much stuff. I've gotten in trouble for it. How do you choose what to read and what you wait so that you can play it?
Oh, definitely your peers. If they're like, oh my god, I just read this. This is amazing. I want you to play in it. Don't read it.
So
I
you
just
need to have
exercise a
people
lot
reach
of
out. Yeah.
I exercise a lot of self-restraint. I don't read something unless I plan on running it. Like, if it's not on my docket to run, I'm not reading it because I don't have time.
And this is
Yeah, it's a
something
lot of
that
work.
I have found very frustrating, especially being on a podcast that reviews scenarios. So when Nathan and Alex are like, yeah, let's cover this, we can do that. Oh, that one's a lot of fun. Like, I haven't read anything.
We have
I
a nice Excel chart.
Yeah, I know, and I haven't been on. I can't sign up on any of them
Oh
because like I bought Fear's Sharp Little Needles, which I think is a really
Mhm.
fun collection of a lot of stories, and I was reading through just one after the other, and then the realization hit me like, wait, I can't play in any of these now. And
Yep.
so I stopped. But now, whenever you say, like, oh, yeah, we should do Unland by Scott Dorward, I'm like, yeah, you should run it for me because I haven't read it because everyone says I should wait to play it, but no one's playing it.
You should.
And eh, thank you.
All right, I'll run Unland for you.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah.
Um,
Verbal
but
contract.
yeah, no, I definitely think outsourcing to other people can be very helpful for it. Sometimes just pulling a holly and going by the cover, going by the opening blurb to judge a scenario if you're going to read it. I mean, that's how I picked Good Vibes Only. And like other ones there is it just sounds like a neat premise and diving in from there, knowing you won't be able to play it again. I one thing that I do not recommend is I fell into an early pitfall. Um, Seth Skorkowski got me into Call of Cthulhu. He had the introductory videos
Mhm.
going through all of the rules. His videos are really fun and informative, and all of his scenario breakdowns and reviews are really interesting and talking about the times that they played it and the ways to go through it. And I watched all of them. And then I realized I now can never play in any of these. And it just like that realization doesn't hit you, especially when you're a newer player. So yeah, it's definitely be aware that there's a double-edged sword there, that the more you know, the less you can play. And the more you're obligated to run now.
Or at least make up your own adventures, which is a whole other uh, discussion.
How do you read scenarios that are in your mind?
So let's talk about some times we've had difficulty critically reading. Are there times where you've realized later, oh, I made a mistake. I read something wrong. I didn't consider an outcome. What sort of things have you looked back on and decided to improve?
I think I mentioned one earlier with Extremophilia. I did not read it necessarily from a player, from an investigator perspective, and the run was more challenging for the player characters than I necessarily intended because I read it from the GM viewpoint.
Mm.
And so being able to carry that forward, I think will be really, it has been really helpful for me, advancing more as a GM. I don't know if I can say anymore in this blurb.
An error that I made early in running RPGs was not finding the voice of my NPCs. And
Mm.
you know, you can have a voice for your BBEG, and that makes sense. And usually a scenario will cover that pretty well. But the voice of the just everyday NPCs that your players are likely to question and interrogate and ask about, what did you see? What did you hear? What's going on? What's the history of this place? And having in your mind, what are the things that just the Joe Everyman NPCs might drop on your players, and little helpful tidbits too. I have found that sometimes the NPCs that are created that are not named in the scenario themselves are the ones that drop the little crumbs that your players will latch onto and take them away. So not finding that voice, and when your players go to question the clerk at the store where all of this happened and they're just like, not helpful. Doesn't really go well. Or they reveal too much, or they what they say doesn't really make sense. So finding that NPC voice is good.
I don't make
Well,
mistakes. Next question.
well, I know from my side, I've attempted to run things like Pathfinder in the past. I'm attempting to do it right now, and I'd say one of the pitfalls I've done when I'm critically thinking through these is I don't think of ways to make the combat as interesting as I'd like. Uh, They can become pretty static. I know we tend to do more horror games, so usually a monster chasing you is scary and likely to end up with you dead. But there are ways in case, like, what if that's not as big a deal? I need to be thinking more as I read these of what are other stakes I can put, right? Are there NPCs that are in danger? Is there loot that might escape if they take too long? Putting in secondary things and looking at that as I'm reading to really to make it interesting, cuz sometimes if you've played any of those games, you round 10 of a combat, everybody's checked out, everybody's done. You got to keep it fresh.
Something that I definitely had early in my GMing days for sure was thinking too much. This is definitely a pitfall. I know I've recommended kind of thinking of it like a movie, but being careful not to allow that to like sheepdog your players because you want them to, or you have envisioned that they're going to go a certain way, and then you try to sheepdog them into going down that path, or just not accounting for, because you know what, no plan survives first contact with your players at all. So not being like prepared mentally in your notes to have the flexibility to move clues around, to move important people around, to just have them so static in your mind that you haven't considered the alternatives of your players aren't going to go to the bookstore first. They're going to go to the museum, or, you know, whatever. So just having in your mind that flexibility where you could place things, what is statically needs to be there because whatever, but some things are not. Like some things are very flexible, and keeping that in mind.
And one final thing I want to add towards that for me is sometimes I critically read something and go, I don't think this is for me. And that's a mistake. Initially, when we were talking about Wander Home, which was a very kind of cozy adventure, I was kind of like, is this something I can do? Especially as we're trying it GM-less. I wasn't confident in being able to keep a story going. And luckily, folks kind of got me to do it. And it's really fun and enjoyable. And sometimes you got to just take a chance.
So I will disagree. Not about the Wanderhome point. Wanderhome is fucking delightful, and I will fight for it. I love Wanderhome. It's so great. Um, I don't think it's a mistake to decide that a scenario isn't for you or that a scenario isn't worth fixing. I think Holly did a noble deed in terms of making puppet shows and shadow plays something really interesting and fun because I read it and no thank you. That would have taken too much work for me to invest to make that something that I would be okay running. And there have been several scenarios that like I can see a glimmer, I can see something really cool here, but it would take a lot of work for me to do. I'm already very busy, and there are a lot of other scenarios that are equally, if not more interesting than this. So I'm going to move over to those. Like, I'll use an example as I'm currently making some modifications to Lights Out by Joe Trier because I think that it has a really interesting start, but then I want to do some tweaks more towards the ending and what that's going for. That's great. I already have a set of pre-gens that I think will make really interesting for that. That's fine. That's not fundamentally rewriting the entire essence of the scenario when I feel like I could have just started from scratch and gone further.
Yeah, I agree with Lex there. Also,
I'm glad to hear you like Wanderhome, Alex.
well, another indicator that I won't run a scenario is if I'm reading through it and my eyes just glaze over and I'm just
Mhm.
zombieing and I'm like, okay, well, I'm not gonna run this because it's not picking up any interest of mine.
Yeah, if I'm bored, the players are going to be bored.
Right. It needs to be exciting, or at least have something that's intriguing enough to keep your attention because your players are going to be playing it longer than you're reading it.
100% good critical reading of a scenario is also identifying when it's not going to be a good scenario. Like identifying what needs to be done, what needs to be fixed, but also this isn't going to be good. Toss it out.
Have you ever been surprised that a scenario was more fun at the table than you thought that it would be in your initial read through?
Oh yeah, lots of times because people
Yeah.
the people aspect of our playing RPGs is what really makes the RPG.
Sure, I'm just trying to get ideas. I've talked a lot about exceptions that make the rule, that like I need to be excited about something before I want to run it. And so
Right.
there's a lot of things I've passed on, but that other folks have said they've had a good time with. So I'm curious if you have ran or played scenarios that went better than you really thought that they would go, just from your initial critical read through. And if there were any lessons that like things that might have made it a little better, like with the wild card player element.
Are we not just talking about scenarios we've written? Because I feel like that every time I run something. Because, like, for example, I ran the first Diggleby game, and there was a real chance that it's like there are people that are gonna watch this and be like, "Did he break out a puppet? I'm out." Right?
And those
But
are not the people I want to be my friends.
Awesome.
right. But that's always a gamble, right? Is you write these and you go, critically reading what I wrote, I think it'll work, but I'm not quite sure. And that's kind of where I'm getting with the sometimes you got to take a risk and just see because you might be surprised and people might be like, yes, we love it. And if they go, no, y- as long as they're nice about it.
But on the inverse of that, or the other side of the coin, there is I have read a scenario, had the red flags, pushed through and ran
Mm,
it anyway, and I was right. It wasn't very good.
yeah,
So,
that's
but like
fair.
there's red flags that you can definitely look for when you're
Let's name some names. Spill the tea, Holly. What scenarios were they?
we can get into those in the episodes dedicated to them.
Oh, that's just more work.
This feels like the Jeopardy Daily Double where we have to just find the random one.
For me, any scenario that has so much technical information and background for the keeper or GM, whoever, that will never come to light and
Mhm.
will never really play a point into the scenario is a big waving red flag for me. It's like, oh, there's too much.
Yeah. I think there is a really good point to that, though, of when I'm reading this, if I do run into pages of things that aren't necessary and will never be discovered, I skip them on my second read through.
100%. You can just skip that information. It's not necessarily a no-go, don't play this. Just
Right.
don't invest the mental energy in, like, remembering it.
Right.
Well, I agree and disagree with these points. I think, Holly, you
Mhm.
raise a great point that if there is, I call them GM dumps because that's all they're going to amount to at the table. It is a lot of information that is made strictly for the GM that the players will never get to experience, never know about. And it's just it's eating up a whole lot of the word count. Sometimes that may be the exciting part. Sometimes that may be what can get me as a GM sort of over the hill in terms of wanting to run it because it gives me more information to work with. But most of the time, it's just a lore dump and it's completely
Mhm.
useless and it doesn't contribute to the scenario itself. This was the defining reason why I decided I was not going to run. I think it's Operation Viscid Malta for Delta Green in the A Night at the Opera collection because it was pages and pages of shit that players will never get to know about. I don't care about these like lore characters. I need a fun scenario. And it wasted a lot of my time. And I just said, nah, I'm good and passed.
So I guess what's the line for you between those two, right? Is between things that the GM will only ever know but is useful versus things that the GM will only know but who cares?
I think that that's it. If it is, and this gets into my entirely unhelpful and subjective rubric, is if it is exciting and if it can
Hmm,
spur more ideas. If you're giving me a lot of GM only information that like can feed into like these are the things that it's done in the past and like that can give me
sure,
more
sure.
inspiration to bring in stuff at the table, that's fine, that's great, that gives me more ammunition. If it's just, oh yeah, these are the things that have happened and this is the stuff and it's already all cleaned up and it's gone, okay, uh what can I do with that? It wasn't exciting, it's nothing that I can add, it's not inspiring. Sorry, I wish I was more helpful in this.
No, that's perfect. So let's talk about some RPGs that, as you've critically read, you go, this is great. This gives me exactly what I need. The information's all there and really makes it a joy. Alex, what kind of stuff have you read that really lights your fire?
Okay, yeah, if it has evocative scenes that I can really expand on, if it has really cool ideas that I haven't seen anywhere else, I will hook onto that and try and make it my own. And that's always a good thing if I'm always trying to improve on what already exists.
Mm. So what kind of system do you find that you've hit that really thumbs up is great? Because I know we talked about Fist before,
Oh,
and
that's the
that one,
answer.
yeah, right.
Yeah,
That
I
really
really, really enjoy Fist.
it if you like pulp action, the Fist Paranormal Mercenary RPG is very fun.
Yeah, I grew up with like action video games and watching action movies, like all the Bond movies. So I'm like, oh, this is great. So I have like a well I can scoop ideas out of.
Like The Ring.
Ah.
How about you, Holly?
I have said it before, and I'll say it again here. I think that I am spoiled by the Miskatonic repository and the one-shot scenarios that Chaosium puts out in general. I think most of them are actually, if they're lacking in some places and need me to overhaul them, they're at least
Mhm.
complete. They usually come with like all the information I need. A lot of them come with pre-generated characters. So I think that like, if you're looking for again, like, I don't have a lot of time, I just need something that's, like, complete that I don't have to interject a lot into that, like yeah. Miskatonic repository is usually a pretty good place to go. But I'm also a sucker for any system that, doesn't require me to do anything. Like, Wander Home, 10 Candles, which can be is so evocative and requires no GM work at all.
I still need to
It-
play that. I've heard such
we are
good
gonna
things about it.
we are gonna play it at Necronomicon, my friend. We will play it.
Or we can play it in Chaosium Con.
Yeah,
We can
can you
play it
come
at
up to
Chaosium
Ann
Con.
Arbor, Holly?
Sure.
I'll have to go look at my calendar. I'm not saying no. I'm not saying
Yeah.
no.
Oh,
Bluebeard's Bride also, like, all of the
Same.
work,
Yeah.
most of the work is done on the players, but like it's such a interesting game. Anyway, sorry, taking away
no,
from
that's great because that's a good example of a case where you can read the rule set and there you go. You've got
just roll
what
with
you
it.
need to
Yeah.
run it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How about you, Lex?
I personally love the flavor of Delta Green as a system. I think that it has such an evocative basis and it's really exciting. Like Holly mentioned, I love like that 90s kind of conspiracy theory vibe to it. And it's a lot of fun and I can get very excited and entrenched in terms of building these grittier paranormal supernatural investigations in it. I also really appreciate Miskatonic Repository for the same reasons that Holly mentioned, as it's a great source to find pretty well done, more or less complete scenarios, especially if there are some scenarios that you can use and port them into other systems. I've ported a lot of Call of Cthulhu scenarios into Delta Green because, again, I like the setting a whole lot. In terms of other setting books that I absolutely love, I have not been able to run nearly as much as I want, and I have backed almost every single Kickstarter for them that I have come across. Morkborg and Cyborg. They are positively dripping, oozing with flavor, and they're so gritty. They're so fucking great. They're so much fun. I get so excited just thinking about them. I really want to run more stuff for them.
Mhm. And I have three that I want to talk about. Three
That's okay. Next
systems.
question.
Yeah, we'll move on. Trophy Dark is a really great system from a critical reading because it breaks down a session into 5 rings. And generally, it's an escalation that goes throughout every single scenario that they have in the book. They separate it by rings. They give you ideas for things that can happen, things that your character will get that aren't immediately death, and they give you hooks to keep people moving. It's each one of them is a gift when you critically read it and just go, I know exactly what I need to do, and I have tables to roll on if I'm not quite sure. It's so easy. My second one, Mothership. I've talked about this before, but the fact that most of their books give you timeline escalations and really concise character descriptions and motivations means that you can read it, go, oh, yeah, that's a cyborg butcher, and he wants to take over the station, which he'll do in 3 days if nobody stops him. Done. I don't really need more than that, but it gives me enough to start from. And the last one, kind of to Alex's very earlier point, is Trail of Cthulhu. The way they break down their clues and locations and give actual flowcharts, the way things are kind of expected to move, or ways your players can connect these things, it makes it so much easier to plan. So let's talk about some war stories. What are some scenarios that you've significantly changed that have really made you pleased?
I mean, going back to the episode we just did, puppet shows and shadow plays.
Mhm.
I, rewrote a ton of it, and I was really happy with the way it turned out.
I cannot give spoilers, but I have made some significant edits to Impossible Landscapes and added some additional plot threads and things in there that, from my GM seat, I think are going to be very interesting to bring to light. I'm waiting to see how they're going to play out, though. So maybe check back in another year based on our current scheduling rate.
Uh, Completely agree with that. I've also changed it, but I think there are a lot of campaigns that really would benefit from considering what players have done earlier, drastically changing the end. So
Oh,
Yeah.
I was changing the end no matter what, believe you me.
Yeah.
But it's the stuff in the middle that
Yeah,
I
right.
think can be
Right.
very interesting.
How about you, Alex?
So I made a change that I was really happy with for Two-Headed Serpent because it is a Pulp Cthulhu campaign. So I put some more action sequences in, and towards the end of that chapter, I added in a scene where they were riding vehicles like motorbikes and military trucks along through the setting, the jungle, getting to the airfield, and the plane was already taking off, but it dropped its ramp,
Oh, fun.
and I had the players like ride into the back of it.
It sounds like a ton of fun.
Yeah. And like you've read Two-Headed Serpent, you've ran Two-Headed Serpent. There's nothing like that.
No, there's not, and it's missing it though, because that's
Yeah.
incredible.
Uh-huh.
Taking notes.
Yeah.
On the opposite side, what's something you've run? I'll start with you, Alex. What have you run pretty much straight from the book?
Hmm. That's a good question. Nothing. Next question. Because like I pretty much tinker with anything, like everything
Mhm.
and anything before I run something. So I can't really genuinely say I run something right out of the book with no changes. I think that's just part of my style and what I perceive to be being a good GM.
Mhm. How about you, Holly?
I run most of the Tales from the Loop scenarios as written.
Oh,
They're,
sure.
they're pretty complete as they are. They capture the feel of the setting very well already. So Snow Day, it's Creatures from the Cretaceous is how it's originally written, but this
You've
title is
changed
so
the name.
spoilery. I change the title. So Creatures from Cretaceous is very good. Um, the Our Friends the Machines, I don't change much of those. And for the more familiar RPG systems, I think I pretty much run the Idol of Thoth as is from our Call of Cthulhu. So
What about you, Nathan?
I think actually the one I've most recently done, and now recent, it's a little bit back. I ran the Morkborg Adventure Box of Shadows,
mm,
and
Oh, I don't know that one.
it I may have to run it again. It's very fun, and it involves a really gross city, and I decided for that one to just roll with what the book had. Is literally it has tables to roll with locations, and I said I'm not going to change what's out there. I'm going to just roll it as we go and see. And I think it was written really well to just see what happens. And we had some really wild stuff. People got eaten by murder seagulls right away, and that sometimes that just happens. And I said, hey, gloves are off. If you get eaten right away, you're rolling up a new character. And I think people go into Morkborg expecting that. So it's kind of fun. Lex?
Good vibes only. I
Mhm.
made some deviations on the fly because players necessitated I improvise some things. Um, but I ran that largely as written with minimal prep required, and it was super fun. Again, it's pretty straightforward, kind of one chunk at a time. Works.
Nice. All right. And I'm going to go backwards for the next one. I'll start out of looking to the future. What are we looking to kind of change and play? I've been reading the Trail of Cthulhu, Cthulhu City, kind of one after the other there with the Cthulhus, but it's a really interesting alternate world setting. Uh, won't go into spoilers with it, but it's very sandboxy. So reading through that, trying to understand how do you run a kind of surreal setting and make it feel grounded. And I think that's an interesting challenge and something I'm looking forward to. How about you, Lex?
I mentioned before, one of my short term goals is I need to make a couple of tweaks to Lights Out by Joe Trier. And I think that'll make a really fun one session, one shot scenario, with just a little bit of polish towards the end. And another that is an ongoing project is I have a campaign planned for Future Perfect. I think that
Mm,
part one of Future Perfect is really fun and pretty darn solid. But I need to do some work in the part. I'm dropping part 2, and I need to do some heavy lifting on parts 3 and 4. And I'm also interspersing several shotgun scenarios in the midst of it there.
Nice.
I think that it can be something really interesting and fun. I just haven't quite gotten fully finished with it yet.
How about you, Holly?
I think the Delta Green scenario Jack Frost is next on my list. I've run it once and wasn't super happy with the way it went because it falls under some of the red flag criterias I've brought up in this, but it really embodies that 90s conspiracy
Mhm.
setting that I love, and it uses a mythos entity that I don't see a lot and is one of my favorites. So I really want to make it work.
Oh, Nyarlathotep?
You got it. Got it in
I'm
one.
making I'm
Wow,
looking at
that
I'm
look.
looking at Lex.
Yeah.
That
I'm
look
looking
is
at Lex.
poisonous.
Alex, what about you? What's on the docket?
I am also running Future Perfect, so we'll have to compare notes, Lex.
Ooh,
I'm actually running it for Nathan.
Why do I feel like yours will have more
No,
explosions
wait,
than
not
mine?
him.
I don't think that's true.
All
I
right,
think
redact that. I'm not running it for Nathan. Fuck Nathan. Huh?
dueling whoa, dueling futures.
Yeah,
Uh-oh.
so I'm running it for like the Thursday group I'm in.
Okay.
We're on like a hiatus, but we'll get back to it. And on top of that, apparently I'm running on land now, so you got to reanimate that.
That's
And I
puzzle.
look forward to it.
I'm super excited to play on land, and I'm really excited to hear the changes that you make to Future Perfect, Alex. We'll have to cover that in a future episode.
Oh, for sure.
Oh.
What else do we have on the docket? Because I know we're running some APs in the near future.
Yeah. And I'm also
Yeah.
going to be running you through Chariot of the Gods. I
There
completely
you go.
spaced on that. We
So
just
you're
got to
gonna
get back to
reanimate that?
scheduling. I'm
So
probably going to
good.
run it pretty much as written too. That's another really solid scenario.
You guys should have Tyler on the show to talk about that. It's such a good show.
That
It's
is the
such a good
plan. After
scenario.
we can do that, we can discuss Chariot and Destroyer since we've all been involved. There
Chef's
you go.
kiss.
Chef's kiss.
Yeah, and eventually I do want to run Impossible Landscapes for myself once
Yeah.
Nathan has finished his run.
Just run it as a solo adventure for yourself.
Yeah.
That's also my plan too. Eventually, is run it from my local group.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm hoping since we're kind of talking about just generally, I really want to get back to Basin and run some more of that. That's a system that I've really loved, and kind of going to the critical reading side again of things, they do a very good job of explaining the creatures, the clues, everything really kind of comes together there. That makes it actually easy to write your own scenarios, which is important, I think, for a lot of these games because you can only go so far with what they have before your players derail you, and you kind of have to come up with your own thing.
Oh, that's interesting. I really need to play Vaesen sometime. I bought the whole starter thing and never opened it.
It's great fun. Keep a lookout for some APs, folks. We hope our deranged utterings are helpful in bringing this topic to life at your table. You can join the discussion on Discord and subscribe or follow the podcast to hear more gruesome consultations. Be sure to check out the show notes for links in the discussion, where to find us, and other links for things like handouts and other resources. So until next time, thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators.
Where your games can die.
Or live.
On the table. A good starting point for me easily is like the picture and the title. Like those are going to be
Yeah.
the first things I think of as GM. So that's probably what I'd jump into anyway.
Okay.
You judge a book by its cover.
I do.
Huh?
Holly judges the book by its cover,
They
at least
could not
initially.
You
Race
heard it
to
here,
it.
folks.
Canceled. Get
I wish
her
there
the
was
fuck out of here.
a visual so we could have that red letter media slow canceled. All right, let me know when, Lex, and I'll put a flag on the time.
I mean, you're hosting, so
Oh fuck.
you go
Okay.
when you feel like it.
Count yourself down.
Just pour to run it. All right. Welcome to RPG
Cancel.
Ah, fuck. Now I have to make a new flag. Son of a bitch.
Wow.